What is the reason that, despite being the world's largest oil producer, the United States still can't rely on its own oil? It's much like a man who grows wheat on his own land, but still has to hold out his hand to others just to feed himself. The world we live in is often very different from what it appears to be. In the same way, millions of containers are shipped from China to the United States every year. But why are so many of them simply abandoned as scrap once they arrive? And amid all of this, why and how is Iran smuggling Boeing 777 aircraft? Welcome once again to another video from Nova Reports. Viewers, did you know that at any given moment, nearly 300 Suzan ships are sailing across the world's oceans? These include oil tankers, LPG carriers, LNG carriers, tugboats, passenger ships, and the vessels that truly keep the global economy moving, container ships. Around 90% of global trade travels by sea. According to estimates, at any given minute, between 6,000 and 8,000 container ships are traveling across the oceans. Thanks to the automatic identification system, they can now even be tracked in real time. If you visit websites like Marine Traffic or Vessel Finder, the entire ocean appears to be covered with tiny glowing dots. Every one of those dots represents a massive ship carrying cargo worth millions of dollars. Most of these container vessels depart from China and sail to destinations across Europe and the United States. What's astonishing is that each vessel carries an average of 5,000 containers. That means roughly 40 million containers are traveling across the oceans at any given moment. From the clothes we wear to the smartphones we use, almost everything we own has, at some point, traveled inside one of these containers before reaching us. At first glance, everything seems perfectly normal. Goods arrive on one side, and the empty containers are simply sent back. But the reality is far more surprising and far more troubling. The balance of global trade is deeply distorted. China exports so much merchandise that an endless flood of fully loaded containers leaves its ports every year. In 2023 alone, China's trade surplus exceeded $823 billion. That means China exported goods worth $3.38 trillion while importing goods worth $2.557 trillion, leaving behind a surplus of $823 billion. The problem begins once those containers leaving China reach Europe and the United States. While China enjoys a trade surplus of $823 billion, the combined trade surplus of all of Europe is only about $41 billion, roughly 95% lower than China's. But once those same containers arrive in the United States, the imbalance becomes even more obvious. The United States is the world's largest consumer market. In other words, its imports and exports are nowhere near balanced. America imports far more than it exports. That means far more containers arrive than there is cargo available to send back. Out of all the containers that arrive at U.S. ports, only about 40% return fully loaded. So the obvious question is, where do the remaining 60% of those containers go? You might assume they simply return to China empty, but that's not what happens. Instead, they sit rotting away in junkyards across the United States. The reason is simple. Shipping an empty container back to China costs nearly $3,000. On top of that, an empty container occupies valuable space aboard a ship, space that could instead be used for a fully loaded container carrying merchandise worth millions of dollars. That's why China has little interest in paying to bring back a used container that costs $3,000 to transport. Instead, China can simply manufacture a brand new container for around $2,000. Every year, approximately 2.5 million new containers are built. At the same time, there's certainly no shortage of old containers. So, the next question is, what eventually happens to all of those empty containers stranded across the United States and Europe? Many of them are sold for inexpensive storage or used at construction sites. These days, people even build homes and offices using shipping containers. And when they're no longer useful for anything else, they're melted down to recover the steel. Because a single shipping container contains roughly 2 tons of it. The next time you pass my oil port and see stacks of steel containers piled one on top of another, remember this. You're not just looking at scrap metal. You're looking at one of the most fascinating symbols of the imbalance that defines the modern global economy. Now let's move on to the question that leaves even the smartest experts scratching their heads. If the United States is the world's largest oil producer, then why can't it simply use its own oil? Looking at the world map today, the United States ranks number 1 in oil production. Even Saudi Arabia and Russia trail behind it. But here's the surprising part. Despite producing more oil than any other country, the United States is also the world's second largest importer of oil. In other words, America sells much of its own oil while buying oil from other countries for domestic use. There are 3 major reasons behind this. The first reason lies in the chemistry of oil itself. Not all crude oil is the same. The oil extracted from American soil is known as light crude oil. It is a lighter grade of crude with lower viscosity. The problem is that America's older refineries were originally designed to process heavy crude oil. Those refineries were built during a time when the United States imported thick, heavy crude from countries like Mexico and Venezuela. Now, if America wanted to refine its own light crude instead, it would have to overhaul much of its refining technology. That upgrade would cost well over $200 billion. Rather than spending that enormous amount of money, the United States simply sells its light crude on the international market at higher prices, while importing cheaper heavy crude from abroad to refine domestically. But oil chemistry isn't the only reason America operates this way. The second reason is a logistical nightmare. Oil is produced in one part of the country, while many of the refineries are located far away. Take Texas, for example. Texas is home to an enormous sea of oil reserves. But there aren't enough pipelines to transport that oil efficiently to New York or the East Coast. California faces an even stranger situation. It has effectively become an oil island. Because of the lack of pipeline connections, California is forced to import nearly 70% of the oil it consumes from foreign countries. As significant as those 2 reasons are, the final nail in the coffin was driven by the Jones Act. During World War I, the United States encountered a major problem while trying to transport soldiers and military supplies across the oceans. The country simply didn't have enough ships of its own to move its troops overseas. As a result, America relied heavily on foreign ships and foreign sailors. But that created a dangerous new concern. What if, someday, the United States found itself at war with those very same countries it depended on? If that happened, America would have neither the trained merchant sailors nor the ships needed to transport its own military forces. There was only one practical solution. The United States needed its own merchant marine fleet, ships that would normally transport commercial cargo, but could quickly be converted for military service whenever necessary. To make that happen, Senator Wesley Jones introduced a bill. Under that law, any cargo transported from one American port to another had to be carried on ships that were built in the United States, owned by Americans, and crewed by American citizens. However, because building ships in the United States costs roughly 3 times more than building them in China, and because American sailors earn much higher wages, the law eventually produced the opposite of its intended effect. Today, only a handful of American ships are available to transport oil from Texas to New York, and their operating costs are so high that they add nearly $5 to the cost of every barrel of oil. As a result, American refineries often conclude that it's actually cheaper to ignore domestically produced oil and import crude from overseas instead. A law that was originally designed to strengthen and protect the United States has gradually become one of the very things working against it from within. These are the unusual reasons why, despite being the world's largest oil producer, the United States still remains dependent on oil from other countries. Now, setting aside America's dependence, Let's talk about Iran's situation. For many years, the United States has imposed sanctions on Iran. Because of those sanctions, Iran cannot legally buy or sell goods with the United States or with America's allies. Yet, if you look at the fleet operated by Iran's Mahan Air, you'll notice a surprising number of American and European-built aircraft. That naturally raises an important question. How does Iran manage to smuggle Boeing 777 aircraft? In 2024-2025, Iran stunned the world when 5 Boeing 777 aircraft suddenly appeared in its fleet. This remarkable operation was made possible through years of careful planning. In the desert near Alice Springs, Australia, there is a massive aircraft graveyard that had long been on Iran's radar. Parked there were 5 retired but still airworthy Singapore Airlines Boeing 777s. Iran couldn't purchase those aircraft directly. Instead, they were acquired through an American-based company called Iron Aviation. The aircraft were then flown to China, where they were sold to a shell company in Madagascar known as UAAN Aviation. These companies had no real existence. They existed only on paper, created solely to stay out of the sight of U.S. authorities. Once the aircraft were registered under the flag of Madagascar, they were no longer under the jurisdiction of the U.S. Federal Aviation Administration. The planes were then transferred to Cambodia. Cambodia is one of the countries where aviation regulations are not as strict. There, the aircraft quietly disappeared from the world's attention. In July 2025, the aircraft filed flight plans showing that they were departing Cambodia for Kenya. Officially, they were supposedly heading there for maintenance. But as soon as they entered Afghan airspace, where monitoring under the Taliban is relatively weak, they switched off their transponders. Once they disappeared from radar, they abandoned the route to Kenya altogether. Instead, they changed course and landed in several Iranian cities, including Chabahar, Zahedan, and Mashhad. By the time the rest of the world realized what had happened, all 5 Boeing 777s had already become part of Mahan Air's fleet. At that point, there was little the United States could do. Every American company involved in buying and selling the aircraft had been registered under fake identities. Today, Mahan Air operates an active fleet of around 50 to 60 aircraft. Most of them are Airbus jets. However, the airline also operates 7 American-built Boeing aircraft. These aircraft continue to land in other countries and use international airspace. Yet the United States cannot simply stop them. Under the Chicago Convention, unless 2 countries are officially at war, one nation cannot legally prevent another country's civilian aircraft from using its airspace or deny them permission to land solely on that basis. However, because of international sanctions, many countries refuse to allow Mahan Air flights to refuel at their airports. If Europe or America's allies were to completely ban Iranian airlines from using their airspace, Iran could respond by closing its own airspace to their aircraft. And if that were to happen, flights traveling between the Middle East and Europe would face significant disruptions and additional costs. We hope you enjoyed another fascinating video from Nova Reports. Be sure to give this video a big thumbs up and share it with others. Thank you so much for all of your kind and encouraging comments. We'll see you again in the next exciting video.